Hello, everyone. Welcome to another CSDS seminar. Today, we are quite delighted to have Sumbul Farah with us. Sumbul, if I can describe you accurately, you're an anthropologist of religion, and you teach at Jamia, sociology at Jamia. She's got her PhD from D School. She's prolific, been published in HAU, Modern Asian Studies, contributions. And today she's talking on a very interesting intersection of the anthropology of religion, and I suspect a possible anthropology of media and religion. And this is opened up a large body of scholarship worldwide, particularly with Charles Hirschkin's scholarship on religion and media. And it's a very interesting field, so we're looking forward to your presentation. And I believe you're going to address the Barelwi tradition and media. So welcome to CSDS. And the floor is all yours. Thank you.
So much, Professor Sundaram. So as Professor Sundaram has already mentioned pretty correctly, this is the title. The title of the paper is "Religion in My Pocket: Affordances and Anxieties of Digitally Mediated Pieties." And religion in my pocket is pretty much what Professor Sundaram was probably referring to in the context of how our digital handheld devices religion to very often engage with religious practices are both convenient affordances as well as being a source of anxieties and concerns, which has given rise to a lot of debates, theological debates within religions as well as across religions. So this paper is really based on some of those debates with respect to two devices. The first one being the mobile phone and the other being the loudspeaker. Now, they're both different kinds of devices, and the kinds of debates that have emerged with respect to both are very different. But what I seek to argue here is that there is something running through between both these debates, which ties up with the question of what happens to religion when it gets mediated, particularly through the digital medium. Because religion, as we'll see, has always been mediated. Religion is accessed through media. But what shifts are brought about through the digital form is something which we'll explore in this particular paper. So I'll begin with this. As technology increasingly shapes the way we live, communicate, move, work, think, imagine, and believe, there emerge possibilities and challenges of living ethically with it. Particularly in the realm of religion, these debates have drawn attention to the mediated nature of reality itself, the resourceful appropriation of technology by religion, and the materializations effected in the socio-cultural environment. I seek to analyze some of the affordances and anxieties made available by the use of technology for the purpose of religious mediation. In order to do so, I draw on the intellectual uncertainty and cultural disorientation wrought by the emergence of novel ways of experiencing the world within the Barelwi worldview and the theological debates that have emerged. So to give a brief background of the Barelwi interpretation of Islam, so it's centered on the city of Bareilly in North India, and it was popularized by an alim, a scholar in the 19th century, Ahmad Raza Khan. And what's distinctive about the Barelwis is their defense of shrine-based practices and veneration of saints, which are not defended on the basis of being traditionally acceptable or culturally rooted, but on the basis of actually being Islamic. So authoritative Islamic texts are cited by Barelwis in order to defend these practices as being truly Islamic, the only real way to be a Muslim. In this context, a very central idea which holds significance for Barelwis is the idea of adab. And that's something which I will be exploring a little more in the context of what we discussed today. So adab is a very multivalent concept which translates broadly into etiquette or respect or even scholarship, adab ki dunya, or even as a greeting. So adab and adab are part of this multivalent universe, which has these layers of meanings with regard to comportment and etiquette, demeanor, etc. And for Barelwis, adab is a very central idea. So adab and its norms extend to all areas of life, and particularly the religious realm. In fact, the charge that Barelwis lay on other schools of thought is that they are not, then they don't have sufficient adab, they are be-adab. So adab, therefore, we'll see how this ties in with the debates, which we'll come to. So adab is something which is very central for Barelwis, and another significant thing about adab is that it can be learned. It has to be learned. So there's an element of disciplining the body, of training in the norms of adab, which means there is this dual relationship between the exterior and the interior, which is articulated through adab. So adab is an outward act. How do I handle something? How do I behave towards someone? But it's supposed to channel an inner orientation and inner belief, which is the aqidah. So by marking that aqidah, you're either marked as a believer, a proper, appropriate Barelwi believer, or someone who is not, does not have adequate aqidah. So that will become problematic, as we'll see when we are talking about religion being mediated through digital forms. So this section is called Religion and as Mediation. In understanding media and mediation as a comprehensive concept that does not constitute an ontologically distinct sphere from religion, I draw on De Vries, who analyzes religion itself as a practice of mediation, to which medias as technologies of representation employed by human beings are intrinsic. So what Birgit Meyer has worked on, and what she's trying to say here is what happens when we include within the idea of media, not just what we usually understand by media, which is techniques of mass communication, but also anything that mediates between the believer and the divine. So it could be a relic, which could be a part of the media. It could be an icon. It could be an image. It could be a book. It could be a saint. It could even be the human body. So what happens when we understand media in all these facets of religion, instead of only locating it in the electronic and the digital forms that we usually understand as media? Seen thus, media enables the materialization of religion in the everyday through things, bodies, texts, sounds, and pictures. At the same time, novel forms of materialization inaugurate experimental forms of engagement with long-standing beliefs and practices, and in the process, invariably encounter resistance from existing structures of authority. The creative engagement and reflexive modes of reasoning that are employed as a consequence are indicative of both the dynamism of tradition as well as the active investment of those who believe. So the debates are actually telling us something very central, both about what we think of tradition as well as the investment of believers in this entire process of trying to understand. So we'll see in the course of this work how there are innumerable fatwa, innumerable questions and debates within religion, all of which pertain to these anxieties regarding what do I do when I receive, let's say, a Quranic verse as a message on my phone. Does deleting it mean destroying it the way you would destroy a paper? Because you can't destroy a Quranic verse written on a paper just like that. You've got to either burn it, you've got to either throw it in the water, not throw, you have got to let it go in the water. So there's a proper modality of adab associated with even something as mundane as receiving a text message. So those are very significant, I think, because they are at the heart of these anxieties regarding what's happening when we are when we are encountering religion in a very different kind of a format, and particularly the materiality of that format, which I'll come to. Further, an analysis of religion that focuses on mediation is particularly apt for understanding Barelwi belief and practice, because one of the most significant loci of difference between Barelwis and the other schools of thought is their belief in intercession that relies on a range of media to intercede between the human and the divine. So this is very controversial. This is actually the most controversial aspect of Barelwi belief. So Barelwis believe that saints do not die, and they are alive in their graves and responsive to the pleas of those who come and visit them. And they have the ability to intercede between the believers and Allah. This practice is attacked very, very strongly by their detractors who argue that this is shirk, which is associating partners with Allah and giving saints a status which is much higher than that of a human being. So this becomes particularly important because this idea of intercession is already telling us something about how important mediation is for Barelwis. So mediation itself as a epistemological idea exists in a very central way in which you can be Barelwi. And for their detractors, of course, this amounts to shirk. Mediation, thus being for Barelwis a cornerstone of faith, offers a theological foundation for us to examine anthropologically the implications of supplementary and compounded forms of mediated religiosity. If the use of media characterizes Barelwi practice in general, I wish to explore what sorts of media, digital and analog technologies, in this case, handheld digital devices and loudspeakers constitute, and their implications for traditional religious practices. Recitation of the Quran, for instance, is an established and authoritative mode of becoming a pious subject. The Quran itself constitutes the medium through which the divine can be accessed. Further, by calling upon the believer to align themselves with the appropriate comportment and bodily requirements to approach, touch, handle, recite, and store it, the act draws upon the paradigm authorized by the Barelwi interpretation. So, considering the Quran is considered, the book par excellence, the sacred book par excellence, it is the word of God, which is collated and brought about in this form. The adab of the Quran is very elaborate. So as a book, it is never stored on a table or at body level. It is also always stored at a level which is higher than the head, lest there be inadvertent beadbi of the Quran. As a book, it's also very often not kept unsheathed. So there's a juzdan, which is a piece of cloth specifically embroidered and sewn for this purpose, usually silk or decorated with trimmings. So that becomes the cover in which it's always accessed, which is significant because the Quran cannot be touched without ritual ablutions, without wuzu. Whereas when it is in the juzdan, it can actually be touched without wuzu. It sort of protects it, sheathes it from that beadbi. It cannot even while being recited, it cannot be just kept on a table or legs, which are part of the lower bodily stratum. It has to be either kept on a pillow or a higher space, higher wooden support. And when it's taken out, it's usually kissed, touched to the eyes. Even when it's kept back, it's kissed and touched to the eyes. So this elaborate manner in which the body is recruited constantly to, act with appropriate adab towards the Quran is something which is significant for us. And it's not just the Quran, which is the physical copy, which is called the Mushaf, which is significant, but also the verses of the Quran. So you would be familiar with amulets and taweez and charms and rings, very often part of spiritual healing practices. All of them contain either the verse of the Quran or very often in numerical format, but they can't be just handed out to people who come and ask for it. So there's a whole process in which the paper is inscribed and then sealed with wax, covered with cloths, after which it becomes sealed from beadbi. And then it can be worn on the body, on the arms or wrists, etc. So this wax and cloth together, which cover that verse, which forms the amulet or the talisman, is called the momjama. And this insulates it against forms of disrespect. And again, we'll see how this becomes relevant later. With the increasing use of electronic equipment and handheld digital devices for fulfilling religious obligations, the notion of adab begins to require re-examination and reinterpretation. Debates around what constitutes proper handling of the Quran on a mobile phone or the appropriateness of using Quranic verses as a ringtone for the cell phones point towards the new predicaments that characterize the use of these devices. I follow David Arnold in referring to these as everyday technologies because his usage encapsulates both the mundane and habitual use of such machines and points towards two important aspects of their use. First, notwithstanding the origins of most of these technologies in the West, they have been appropriated by the rest of the world in creative and idiosyncratic ways. And second, it makes sense to examine relatively smaller machines rather than large-scale technological applications as obvious examples of technology. In my examination of the former, I would also like to draw on Michel de Certeau's analysis of consumption itself as a form of production, where consumers make products their own through the act of usage. In a sense, the mobile phone used for religious purposes offers an illustration of de Certeau's tactical usage, as well as Edgerton's Creole technologies, used for reading or listening to the Quran and its translations, setting alarms for prayers, downloading Islamic calendars, ascertaining Qibla directions, using Islamic banking services, apps to find halal food, and a range of other such actions. The mobile phone doubles as the divine word, both written and spoken, the imam who summons believers to prayer, the alim who guides, and so on. By exploring the social life or cultural biography of the device, we will examine in this article how the technological and the social interpenetrate each other. Another important device that constitutes everyday technology, which I discuss here, is a loudspeaker. While it is a commonly used machine, it is the source of much debate and disputation among Barelwis. The question of its permissibility during obligatory prayers, namaz or salat, is highly contested. So the debates around these index precisely those anxieties which we are trying to explore. Coming on to the section called Adab of the Quran. With highly elaborate norms of adab guiding Barelwi orientation towards the Quran, it follows that its digital version should occasion questions regarding its use and storage. If the physical copy of the Quran, Mus'haf, is not to be touched without ritual ablution or wuzu, how does an individual ensure a state of wuzu on each occasion they handle a mobile phone that carries the Quran within it? Alternatively, can an individual carry it in their pocket or to spaces deemed unclean? And this is, again, part of the reason why I call it religion in my pocket, because you don't, of course, carry anything sacred to places deemed unclean, but your phone is very often carried everywhere. So what happens to this Quran? Is it beadbi? How do you manage this possibility? Alternatively, can an individual, a common anxiety concerns an inadvertent beadbi if the phone is carried to the toilet or the bathroom. In response to such questions, most religious scholars argue that the adab of the Quran must be extended to the digital version when it is displayed on the screen, but not when the software application is closed. So we'll see how a number of these fatwa employ such different styles of reasoning to actually manage the crises and the concerns that believers have. So one of them being this, which is that when it's visible, it's the Quran, and when it's not, it's the phone. To provide reasoning for the same, the analogy of a newspaper carrying Quranic verses is cited. When it is permissible to touch the rest of the newspaper and also the blank spaces without wuzu, but not the printed verses. This interpretation, however, is not universally accepted. Some ulama arguing that when one touches the screen of an electronic gadget, it is not the words or the huruf which are in contact with the finger, but the physical barrier of the screen. Countering this, so this is the other idea, the fact that in any case, you're not touching the word, it's the screen. But then this is again countered by this alim who pointed to me that the image visible on the screen is the object. The projection of huruf on the screen sacralizes the display in a form analogous to that of the newspaper bearing Quranic verses. So they're very interesting analogies in order to figure out whether or not this is the actual Quran or whether or not this can be touched without being in a state of wuzu. When, however, the Quran is not displayed on the screen, it is considered covered and concealed. Now here, going back to the analogy of the Juzdan and the Momjama, it becomes, and a lot of scholars themselves argue in these terms, that a Quran which is not visible on your screen is like a Quran which is hidden by a Juzdan or by the Momjama, which makes it immune to some extent to any beadbi. At the same time, it must be remembered that the digital Quran does not lend itself to the elaborate handling rituals that involve kissing it and touching it to the eyes, because as a material artifact, the phone does not inspire spiritual awe or reverence. So even when the question of handling the Quran when it is displayed is sorted, even when the Quran is visible on your screen, you still don't kiss it and touch it to the eyes, because here the materiality, I think, becomes very significant. You cannot forget that it's a mobile phone and not a physical copy that you are handling. Similar fears are enumerated by studies of the use of digital formats of the Quran among Muslims in different parts of the world. They claim that people find that for recitation, the digital Quran is convenient because most of them do not follow a planned schedule of recitations. And of course, it is hard to carry a printed book all the time. At the same time, the respondents voice anxieties about the correctness of these versions. And this anxiety around correctness is something very significant when it comes to the Quran, which is supposed to be the word of God, transmitted unchanged. So this anxiety is something we'll encounter again. About the correctness of these versions, as well as their incapacity to inspire an attitude of reverence in the way the Mus'haf does. A quotation from a respondent encapsulates this concern, and I quote, "What makes me worry more is that with time, people may start dealing with the paper Mus'haf as they deal with the device, paying it less respect. Our children will grow up not knowing those qualities and considerations of dealing with the Mus'haf if we keep looking at screens while reciting Quran." So we come to the ontology of the digital world. What is happening when this Quran is being transmitted online? Not transmitted online, when it's being, when it's visible on a digital device. What happens? What is this digital world? The underlying concerns emerge to be overwhelmingly about the ontological status of the displayed word. In the field of art, the aura that is conferred on the original artwork, according to Walter Benjamin, is what is lacking in the reproduction, thereby depriving the latter of the same ontological status as the original. Mass-produced objects of everyday use, on the other hand, lack an original to begin with, as argued by Verbeek. They are instead copies of ideas. And I quote, "Ideas cannot possess auras, for they can never be experienced in the here and now and be authentically present." How do we then begin to understand the ontic position of the digital copy of the Quran? Now, what's interesting here is that the Quran in any case is always accessed as a copy. So the Quran, right from the moment of the original revelation, from where it was memorized first, of course, by the Prophet and transmitted from the Prophet to his companions and from his companions to yet other people, is very, there's a lot of literature on how it's a very significantly oral tradition, this sense of hearing and memorizing and transmitting. So the Quran itself it took a long time for it to be codified and put together. It was only by 633 AD that it was codified into a single manuscript. And even after that, every copy that you carry is a copy of that original revelation, but it is a copy. Each reproduction here, so from its original transmission to inscription on leather and parchment and date stocks to a manuscript, each of these reproductions is authorized by its fidelity to the original revelation. The physical copies have accreted over time an assemblage of linguistic and grammatical signs meant for believers not familiar or well-versed with Arabic. So there are changes which have come about. The scripts which are used for speakers of, or non-Arabic speakers, speakers who use, especially in South Asia, those copies contain punctuation marks and diacritics in order to enable them to figure out the actual pronunciation. Be that as it may, they're believed to be exact copies of the original revelation, copies whose faithfulness is vouched for by none other than Allah himself. The physical copy of the Quran is thus both an icon and an index, with its materiality lending itself conveniently to bodily orientations and the economy of gestures that signal its ontological status as the divine word. On the other hand, the digital copy shifts the terms of engagement to a completely different register of simulation and authenticity. If the Quran on the phone is as real as the Mus'haf, how does one chart out appropriate adab towards a gadget, the very utility of which renders it mundane? Further, when the words vanish from the screen, the consensus among scholars is that the device can be treated like the ordinary object that it is. At the level of technology, then, the digital Quran could well exemplify the simulacrum that for Baudrillard conceals the absence within. After all, the words that light up the screen are merely illuminated pixels that combine to create the image of the Quran. There is arguably no copy of the Quran that is stored within the device. It is materialized instantaneously through a series of programs and algorithms, and it disappears when the programs cease to run or switch over to another application. The question of authenticity of the displayed image recalls the iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries in the Byzantine Empire that, according to Baudrillard, was primarily about the possibility and threat posed by simulacra. What becomes of the divinity, and I'm quoting from Baudrillard here, what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons, when it is multiplied in simulacra? Does it remain the supreme authority simply reincarnated in images as a visible theology? Or is it volatilized into simulacra which alone deploy the pomp and the power of fascination? The visible machinery of icons being substituted for the pure and intelligible idea of God. Unquote. La Rocca analyzes, so there's this photographer called Cindy Sherman, and a lot of her photographs are characterized by indeterminacy. So you don't know what you're really looking at, whether that photograph is posed. A lot of them are self-portraits. So it's difficult to make out whether it's a real corpse or the photographer masquerading using prosthetics to present herself as a corpse. Is it a part of police investigation? Is it part of a voyeuristic photograph? So there is this indeterminacy which La Rocca analyzes, and he argues that it is both a copy and a simulacrum. The only question remaining whether its doubleness is contemporaneous or sequential. The disorientation for La Rocca arises not from the techniques of representation as much as the ability of the viewer to see the actualization of both possibilities. An analogous indeterminacy marks the status of the Quran displayed on a digital surface. Like Sherman's photographs, it's both a copy and a simulacrum, its doubleness being both contemporaneous and sequential. It is this dual possibility and threat that is at the heart of the Barelwi anxiety about the digital version of the Quran. When displayed, it is no less iconic than the Mus'haf, which calls forth the repertoire of gestures relating to handling and storage. And yet the materiality of the medium is significant. After all, the digital surface of the Quran can be touched without ritual ablutions. How do we read the epistemological implications of this tacit acknowledgement of the digital format not being an iconic representation? Evidently, the surface being touched is not the real Quran. While the words being displayed are faithful to the original text, they are materially different. The materiality of the medium divests them of their aura more than just the fact of the reproduction. And I argue one of the most important reasons for this loss is a recognition of the simulated nature of digital image. Like the iconoclasts who sought to destroy images because they were alert to the threat that simulacra carried within, the acknowledgement of a different ontic register of the digital Quran mirrors an analogous understanding of the simulated world. So what Baudrillard is arguing is that the iconoclast, between the iconoclast and the iconophiles, is actually the iconoclasts who really understood the power of that image. And it's, again, a very similar idea at the heart of the digital Quran here. So this anxiety arises precisely because the simulated image is understood to be a simulation and not a real copy. Coming to the next section on Islamic soundscapes. While recitation from the digital format of the Quran is permissible and increasingly common, the use of Quranic verses as a phone's ringtone is not permissible on two counts. First, here the purpose of the rendition of the ayat is to be alerted to a phone call rather than to listen to the Quran. And second, the ayat needs to be interrupted in order to receive the incoming phone call, both of which amount to beadbi. Hirschkind, which he examines the ways in which listening to a sermon is an ethical performance, and a distinction is drawn between listening attentively as well as merely hearing what is being said, and which precludes the ethical receptivity of the former. The ayat as a ringtone creates an analogous soundscape that demands particular modes of body orientation towards it. Failure to comply is an ethical lapse and indicative of an unsound belief system. At the same time, the failure is not incidental, but an inevitable consequence of the triggering sound. The problem arises precisely because the soundscape is materialized out of place in a manner in which it cannot sustain its own existence. The very purpose of a ringtone is to call attention to itself, to disrupt the flow of things in order to introduce what might seem a more significant interruption. More than attention, then, the ringtone visibilizes the simultaneous recruitment of body in practices of inattention. And Brian Larkin's worked on the loudspeakers in Nigeria precisely to show. Hirschkind, of course, is interested more in the question of attention and how the body is oriented formally to what one is hearing on these cassette sermons. Larkin is looking at Hirschkind did. Oh, Larkin did. Okay, so that's wonderful. So that the techniques of inattention, which he's talking about, are something which problematize this idea of the ayat as a ringtone. You can't possibly pay attention to a ringtone except for it as a ringtone, which will be interrupting in order to take the call anyway. The debates surrounding the use of the loudspeaker for namaz point to another aspect of these soundscapes. Here, the question of authenticity of sound becomes paramount because the gestures of namaz must follow the voice of the person who leads the prayer, the imam. Barelwi ulama argue that the voice being relayed through the loudspeaker is not identical to that of the imam because of the transformation it undergoes from the moment of enunciation. And this debate is something which is very similar to the modes of reasoning employed by a lot of ulama from other schools of thought as well. So Navida Khan's worked on it, Alimiyat published how a lot of Deobandi scholars have also indulged in exactly the same debate. So when you have voice coming, the imam's voice coming out of a loudspeaker, is it his own voice or is it something else? And the Barelvi ulama strongly argue that it's, and even the Deobandi ulama to a great extent argue that it's not the same thing. Because this distance between the speaker and the audience is traversed through three devices: the microphone, the amplifier, and the loudspeaker. The microphone converts the sound waves to electric oscillations, which are then amplified by the amplifier, and finally reconverted to sound waves by the loudspeaker. The voice that emerges from the loudspeaker is thus not an original one, but only an imitation. Transformed into electric signals and transmitted through electric wires, the emergent voice is believed to be qualitatively different from the initial utterance. It is interesting that not only religious leaders, but scientists too are claimed to share this opinion. Referred to as Avaz ka photograph of the voice or a copy, knuckle of it, it is likened to an echo, a goonj or a sada in a fatwa by Mustafa Raza Khan. Mustafa Raza Khan was the son of Ahmad Raza Khan, and he was a very famous jurist in his own right. So it's a very famous fatwa that he has with respect to loudspeaker, where he actually claims that the voice coming out of a loudspeaker is a copy and not the original. And he likens it to an echo, which is also impermissible for the congregation to follow for the purpose of ritual prayers. It is claimed, therefore, that it cannot be likened to that of an imam, and it's invalid to follow it for the gestures of namaz. The concern crystallizes the pervasive fears of a society permeated by technology, that one was taking the lead of a machine over a human, which was unacceptable. Alternatively, there are arguments that the sound could be seen as an interjection from outside. So that's equally impermissible to take, to hear and to act upon a sound which is not coming from the imam, and to act upon it invalidates the prayer. So that's equally problematic. Thus, transduction, introduction of unwanted sounds, and the cognitive dissonance produced by high levels of sound all raise anxieties when the loudspeaker is utilized for the purpose of prayer. So it is not acceptable for the purpose of prayer, but it's considered perfectly acceptable for sermons, for recitation of the Quran, for other purposes, but not for ritual prayer. On the basis of use, therefore, the jurists among Barelvis and also the Deobandis make a distinction between beneficial and harmful technologies. The categorization hinges overwhelmingly on the primary use of the devices, on the basis of which they're classified as either forbidden or versatile or reprehensible. Forbidden are those which are deemed impermissible, like musical instruments, entertainment devices. Versatile are those which are permissible or impermissible depending on how they're used. For instance, the airplane, telephone, artillery, and there's, again, a lot of literature, a lot of fatwa literature also on how they are debated out. And reprehensible, which consists of versatile tools used for impermissible activities like the gramophone. Opening up the discussion to soundscapes beyond the salat introduces very different dynamics into the analysis of these acoustic environments. While the permissibility or impermissibility of the loudspeaker for the purpose of ritual prayer depends on the authenticity of the sound that emerges from it, the terms of engagements shift substantially when it is employed for other purposes. Two significant implications of the move are: one, the question of intentionality is rendered salient, thereby bringing into focus the listening agent and their entire sensorium more than the sound itself. And second, the processes of negotiation, conflict, and violence that mark the use of amplified sound in multi-religious and plural societies, which Larkin is also talking about, that comes to the fore. So having discussed the problem with adab of the digital device and what happens when the loudspeaker alters the voice of the imam in a manner where it is rendered a copy of itself. I want to talk now about sensory anthropology and to actually think about what's happening in this process of hearing and seeing. So this is called, do you see what you see and hear what you hear? Perception as a social act. Both the cases cited here draw our attention to the social meanings of technological artifacts and their products. Viewed through the lens of the contentions and debates that shape their application, the motif of the real and virtual come to the fore in both. The debates around the adab of the Quran center on the status of the image, whether it constitutes the object or Quran itself or is merely a reflection of it. Similarly, the correct response to the namaz being led by an imam is dependent on the character of the voice coming from the loudspeaker. The correct response is contingent on the authenticity of the image or the sound. While the physiological senses of hearing and seeing allow us to perceive these stimuli, the evaluation of their authenticity or inauthenticity rests on cultural understandings of the real and the copy. The concern here is summarized by Mia, and I quote, "In a world in which copies surpass originals, the monotheistic God's transcendent status as creator of originals does not compel the same belief and obedience as it did prior to the age of mechanical and electrical reproducibility. Modern technologies not only challenge the formal aspects of devotional practices, but also undermine the idea of God as creator." Anthropology of the senses invites us to examine the ways in which both physiology and culture mediate a perception of the world. Perception comprises both our physical faculties and social meanings. Using the examples of a variety of sensory models employed in different cultures, Klassen and House urge anthropologists to be receptive to sensory codes that govern societies and to examine how everyday practices encode sensory experience with specific meanings. At the same time, technologies open the possibilities for innovative and creative modes of perceiving the world. The mediation and its materiality, therefore, have important consequences for the sensorium of the believer. In this case, the subjective experience of the world for them is fraught with anxieties. Belting points to the shift in our understanding of human perceptive capacities emerging from the invention of technologies like the telescope, microscope, and X-rays, which familiarize us with a particular kind of absence, namely absence from sight and not absence as such. And in order to access these presences, we need to deploy the prosthetic function of visual media, which consequently impels us to place more trust in visual machines than our own eyes. In the case of the digital Quran, the tactile and kinesthetic response of the believer is linked to and determined by the authenticity of the visual stimulus. The sensory response is itself mediated through the material configuration of the object. Is it the screen being touched or is the projection of Quranic huruf? Also, the tactile experience of handling the silk Juzdan covered Quran cannot be replicated by the plastic sensation of mobile phones, materially incapable of evoking the transcendent divine. Similarly, the loudspeaker frames the unreal sensory environment of the subject, and the originality of the auditory stimulus becomes the necessary condition for an appropriate kinesthetic response. The sensory values that are encoded in and expressed through these debates point towards their significance for Barelwis. The cultural meanings of adab and subjective interpretations of correct religious practice circumscribe these sensory responses. It therefore becomes imperative to figure out whether the visual, the auditory, and tactile senses can be trusted to distinguish between the real and the virtual. If not, one needs to devise alternative ways of doing so. One such way is to harness science to explore the configuration of these artifacts themselves in order to evaluate their fidelity to the original objects. So it's very interesting how a lot of these debates with regard to these objects actually, even among ulama themselves, use science and established scientific papers sometimes to argue their point. As we saw in the context of Mustafa Raza Khan's fatwa, where he actually argues it's a copy. An alim actually used physics when I spoke to him about the Quran on a mobile phone and argued that just as an image in a mirror is a virtual image and not real, and therefore a copy which does not have the same value as the original, the digital Quran is equally virtual. And the use of the idea of virtual is important. So virtual being not real in a very significant sense. Just a second. I'm sorry. In this case, he had said virtual, but I'll look up the literature again. I have a lot of it. He uses a knuckle very often. So tasveer hai, knuckle hai. The discourse around the authenticity of these stimuli is premised on a positivist understanding that the senses might be deceived, but an inquiry into the underlying science will reveal the truth. As mentioned in the loudspeaker debate, the legitimacy of science and reason is harnessed to the defense of religious precepts. So even in the debate, loudspeaker debate, it's argued entirely in the terms of physics. You know, what's transduction, what's amplification, and what's happening very clearly at the level of the signals, rather than being argued on the basis of traditional understandings of what sound is. Although there are analogies which are made use of, which are traditional. The concerns expressed in these debates revolving around the original and the copy, as I mentioned, are reminiscent of the iconoclastic debates, which divided the population between iconophiles and iconoclasts in the Byzantium Empire. The debate drew on the possibilities of the relationship between the invisible image and the visible icon. To counter the charge of the iconoclasts, the iconophiles denied the consubstantiality of the image and the icon and maintained that the relationship was merely one of formal resemblance. The iconicity of the digital Quran or the electronically and digitally transformed voice is similarly at stake with regard to the concerns of the believers. The difference between the two is that a digital copy of the Quran is deemed to be an acceptable icon for the reasons we have just explored, while the electronically reproduced voice of the Imam is not. While every copy of the Quran is accepted as an iconic representation, the digital reproduction introduces a different modality of perception. The instability is dual. Not only is the digital format inherently transient in form, the lack of authenticating sources highlights its constitutional precariousness. So here, this question of the authenticity of the Quran comes to the fore, because even when you look at the literature with regard to the coming of print and the concerns regarding whether or not there might be errors introduced in the process of printing and binding, etc., these anxieties get even more amplified in the context of the digital, which is ephemeral. So, and also more difficult to pin down as opposed to a physical copy. The concerns regarding its authenticity stem from the questions of its iconic status that have existed even prior to the digitization process. On the other hand, the electronically and digitally voice of the Imam is widely accepted as a copy not faithful to the original. Rather, it can be likened to the Platonic simulacrum, which is, quote here, which is a demonic image. It remains an image, but in contrast to the icon, the semblance of the simulacra is like the ruse and trickery of an impostor. It is indeed the demonic nature of the loudspeaker that is underlined in the use of the term shaitani ala for it in Intizar Hussein's novel Tazkira. Now, when Navida Khan is talking about the loudspeaker debates in Pakistan, she mentions this novel by Intizar Hussain called Tazkira, in which the protagonist there's a protagonist who moves from India to Pakistan with an elderly companion, a woman companion. And initially they settle in the outskirts of Lahore, and there is no mosque around them, which is very disorienting for the old lady, who argues that, if she does not hear the azan, there is no way of organizing her day, and she has no sense of the time or the day or her bearings in a new place. They eventually shift to a place which is very close to a mosque, which has a loudspeaker. That's when she calls it a shaitani ala, because it's a constant disruption. And this element of noise is very important in the concerns around the loudspeaker, because multiple mosques are very often in close proximity to each other. Here, what I have not explored here, but which is also another interesting distinction between the schools of thought. So very often different schools of thought, Barelwis would have their own mosques with an azan at a slightly different time, as opposed to, let's say, a Deobandi mosque, or as opposed to an Ahle Hadith mosque, thereby marking out, and it's interesting in the context of adab, which I have not worked on here, but elsewhere. So in the context of adab, people would say, nahi, ye to Deobandi azan hai. We don't need to bother about this. Although it's an azan that you're hearing, but because the time identifies it as, the kind of azan it is. So, so Shaitani Allah again points towards the other kinds of anxieties that exist with regard to the loudspeaker. I'll come to the conclusion now. The claim that the form of mediation shapes our consciousness and reception of religion is testified to by the breadth of affordances, conveniences, efficiencies, as well as questions, concerns, and crises that are introduced by modern technological media. Campbell urges us to explore the generativity of digital religion that enables a complex interaction with tradition, allowing for newer and more elastic forms. As we have explored here, some of these elastic forms emerge with the increasing use of digital devices for accessing religion textually, ritually, and even pragmatically. The unspectacular nature of modern technology enables a reliance on these everyday technologies in a manner that they're rendered ubiquitous, familiar, and mundane. Despite this, or perhaps on account of this, it becomes ever more important to trace the disturbance that their adoption and use leaves in its wake. In the context of the Quran, we can sense the obvious dilemma. I have also tried to draw on, which again, I could not get the time and space to do here, on the Ongian legacy of thinking about orality and literacy, and how Stephen O'Leary writes about it in his article called Cyberspace, a Sacred Space, where he traces how taking forward Ong's ideas about how when a culture moves from the oral to the literate, the sensorium contracts, it becomes more visual, it becomes more, it becomes less trusting of the oral and the oral. And O'Leary traces it to the digital format, which is something I also would like to take further in this context, to see how the sensorium again expands. So you have videos, you have GIFs, and you have images and icons and emojis, all of which again take us to a reintroduction of a lot of those elements outside just the visual. Movement becomes a part of it. I would argue even touch, and the element of touch is something which comes back in a way, not as straightforwardly as sound does, but it does. So even though there is this sense that you're touching the screen, you have, somebody was telling me about a tablet, which when you touch it, it feels like paper. So this is interesting in how even in terms of touch, the textual experience, the textual materiality, not textual, the tactile materiality of it is sought to be, to reconform to what we have actually left behind. So it should feel like paper. It should not feel like a screen. So drawing on this Ongian legacy of foregrounding the techniques of mediation in an understanding of the cultural deployment of artifacts, objects, beliefs, and practices, we have seen that the Quran has moved from a divine revelation to oral transmission, memorized recitation, improvised inscription, authorized compilation, print, to finally digital transmission. The question arises, how do we understand the reconfiguration of the Quran when it migrates from one mediated form to another? What are the registers on which this reconfiguration occurs? Mia's argument that the aura gets detached from the copy in the case of the recorded Quran that cannot find expression in the believer's body that constitutes the traditional aura of the Quranic recitation. He further argues that modern technology does not merely disrupt the traditional aura of ritual, but also disrupts traditionalist assumptions about creation. In positing the digital Quran as both an icon and a simulacrum, I take a different direction than Mia's reasoning, and therefore argue that the aura, unlike in Benjamin's conceptualization, is neither lost nor claimed in an absolute manner. It is evoked or not, depending on the form of the copy that one is oriented towards. With respect to the debates around the ontological status of the sound that emerges from the loudspeaker, it is equally evident that the crisis is contextual. And the use of the machine is not just accepted, but quite popular when it comes to the transmission of sounds not related to the ritual prayer. So to end it here, what is significant here again is, which I started out with, how both these elements of what's happening at the level of religious authorities in dealing with these crises, as well as the level of the believers in trying to make sense of these changes, is something which comes to the fore in these debates, and I think which needs to be carried further. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about why. It's actually a lot of riches, a lot of interesting provocations, and let me try. It's not a question; it's a dialogue. Okay, so let me start with the way you set it up, and what I found most productive was the way you end it, and I'll try and set up the different threads in it, and open up things that you could consider. Okay. Now, you began with the classic anthropology of religion and media, Birgit Meyer, who are setting up religion vis-a-vis a notion of media res, as something that connects. It's something in between that connects, right? And then you moved towards a kind of anthropology of religion, which is theologically driven, where you're not looking at lived practices of religion, but you're looking at theological approaches when they deal with media. What forms of ethical conduct, what you call other, what hierarchy do you set up for believers? What statements of value you set up, which is a theological term. You read theological texts, you interview people, but this is not engaging with the way people are managing the sensorial world. We're not talking of ordinary believers. We're talking of theological interpretation, right? Which is very important, which is absolutely important in this debate. Now, in the latter part, so you take something like affordance. Affordance, the classic, it comes out of cognitive psychology. Gibson sets it up, and it comes out of this whole ecological domain. These are capacities that open up within a relational field, right? That's what an affordance is. It comes into STS, which is really about material objects. So the problem which you very nicely set up in the end is this hierarchy of value is permanently disturbed once you move into the digital. Therefore, when you refer to Ong, it's not wrong, but it's not the same thing. There's a permanent sphere of disturbance, which is a challenge for theological authority. How do you, what forms of habit do you set up for believers, right? Now, that's one, which is why very productive. Presentation opens up all kinds of questions. So, okay, if you're a believer, your phone, which is an object you could take to the bathroom too, which is something that has lost the sacred object that you set up right in the beginning very nicely. Now, how do you partition this world? One, you could do it through theological rendition, which is fair. But how do users partition this world? How do they react to this sonic, overwhelming, which Larkin says it's a training of the body. He's talking about training. You partition certain sounds, you keep certain sounds, and you transform the habitual. So how would this come in? You understand what I'm saying? Theological authority dealing with the disturbance of value, users who are hundreds of millions of people dealing with thousands of sounds. How do they deal with it? Or is it separate? Or does it overlap? Because the older affordance model, which is really environmental, changes with algorithmic thing, in which you're not clear where it ends. So it's a very interesting, it's a great moment for you to be doing your research, because it's a world that is opened up. So, but thank you very much. You opened up a lot of ideas, but these are 2 points I thought we could carry a conversation and open up the yeah. Yeah.
This is wonderful. Thank you very much. They're very important points, some of which, of course, I'll think about a little more. But when it comes to, and again, I'm thinking aloud here. So as a discussion, so when it comes to the debates I'm talking about, they do happen to be definitely theologically driven. And I'm citing ulama here. I'm also citing a lot of this printed literature outside of the fatwa, but again, very much in the context of authoritative texts. And yet, especially with regard, because I mean, the fieldwork that I've done, and this is something which is true not just of this particular area, but among Barelvis in general. And I think the question becomes slightly different when we talk about Barelvis. To begin with, Barelvis, the kind of Islam that's followed by Barelvis as the true Islam, has a very strong component of the lived, which is woven into being Barelvi. So unlike, let's say, a more, again, using the word reformist is very problematic. Barelvis themselves call themselves, they would call themselves reformist. But even otherwise, so when it comes to adab, for instance, and this is something which I've tried to argue in my thesis, and I need to get that out, of course. So this idea of adab has a very significant democratic aspect to it, which allows itself to be taken to such extremes where it actually becomes very problematic even for the leaders to defend. So for instance, adab at a shrine, and it's very clearly laid out. So when you are entering a shrine, you have to, you don't have to, see, adab does not have a very codified form, but it becomes codified through a certain usage. So those usages demand that you kiss the threshold and you enter, and you keep, of course, leave your slippers outside, and then you touch and kiss the wall and the grill, etc. Now, taken a little further, there are, something which I'm sure you'll find at many shrines, people are crying and they're praying, and very often they would also prostrate. They would also do sajda to the saint. Now, this becomes very tricky for Barelvi leaders and ulama to defend. This is why, Barelvis are attacked for, doing shirk. They are, so, you can't prostrate before anyone but Allah. This becomes a very clear way of sort of transgressing that. And then Barelvis, the ulama would tell you that this is out of respect. It is haram. We cannot defend it, but you have to understand it stems from adab, and the adab stems from the correct aqidah. So it's a very tricky way in which that lived experience is constantly being brought in as theologically not entirely defensible, but still, to some extent permissible. So people would say, हाँ ये गलत कर रहे हैं, पर है तो अकीदा सही है. So adab becomes paramount. So he or she might not know what he or she is doing, but the aqidah is correct. So there's a way in which the lived and the everyday individual, very often idiosyncratic expression of adab is also accommodated and sometimes even defended. So I'll if taken this idea again and trying to tie in with what you just pointed out, the concerns, this partitioning, and again, I'll think a little more about it, but from what I would immediately answer is that this partitioning is very, very flimsy for most of, and so even for people. So these concerns, they might not be immediately, so you get a phone, or what do you do with your phone when it has the Quran? A lot of these concerns are sometimes asked to scholars, sometimes, it's sort of figured out by, through conversations, through, of course, media, television and online fatwa. They're all sort of helping channel, put this together. So there, I would not call this entirely theological driven. You know what I mean?
Then I asked this, last time we had a presenter, very interesting presenter, how people record themselves during Muharram.
Right.
Which is totally different. It was not allowed at one time, and people started recording themselves
right.
and sharing. So doing this process,
right.
just I'm interested in the processual forms of,
right.
What happens to this.
Right. I get it. So yes, there's of course a very strong processual element to it, and that's why these concerns, they're all negotiated within an everyday. It's a very emergent, contingent way of thinking about it. But yes, I agree, and I think I'll definitely want to think a little more about how else can I weave in or at least emphasize the processual aspect. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. There's the first question, Dhananjay Rai. Thank you for this wonderful lecture, Farah. Does the idea of decentering space change the aura of the text due to be placed outside the sanctum sanctorum? In the case of affirmation, how does mediation shape the contours of self and the other? In other words, does it lead to hermeneutics or integration? I didn't understand it, but
yeah, I'll just read it again. I'll see what I can take from it. So decentering space change the aura of the text. See, the aura, that's what I'm arguing here. So in Benjamin, I don't think anything is happening to the aura. What happens to a Quran, which is in any case lacking or always having that aura, simply because it's always going to be the copy that you access. It's never going, even the original revelation is accessed as a memorized recitation. So it never had an aura, or maybe it always had an aura. So that's why I'm not going with the idea of aura at all. I don't think Benjamin's idea works for this at all, because this is the Quran, and whether you're encountering it on a screen or on paper or on a leather parchment. But what is happening is more than the sanctum sanctorum, I'm not sure what that means, but more than that, the materiality of the device is what's changing something about this. And I won't call it aura, because I think the aura is very much there. It is still the Quran, but something is being materially shifted, which I'm trying to understand here. That's the best I can do.
Okay, thanks, Farah, for a wonderful paper. I'm trying to think aloud. What about the very basic? Technology actually aids religion. Why is that not invoked in these discourses? Why is it always invoked as a problem and not as a kind of thing that without technology, where would Quran be, right? Or any just text would be. So that is one kind of historical thing that comes to my mind. And there is a kind of continuing history of how other technologies, kind of intermediated technologies, would either kind of sacredness, right, or to thing. For example, calligraphy. Calligraphy also invoke that authenticity of the text, right? In sculpture, in all the buildings, etc., etc., and all that carries through. That is something that is very high. Cannot touch it, right? You can only see it and be very impressed by the wherever it is, right? And how it's your profane body is not in a position to receive the sound which is sacred. So is there a problem, for example, in so is there a problem, for example, in listening to the azan when I'm in the toilet, right? Which is a place I go to purify myself, right? Ironically, but it's considered impure, right? I'm giving you a parallel example now from Hinduism. I'm coming back from Kanpur, and Visarjan, like you said, the Quran has to be, put away and ceremoniously and very religiously. Ganesh and Lakshmi They are being worshipped the night before in crores of lakhs of homes, and they are then, then Visarjan the next day. Nowadays, you're not allowed to throw them into the Ganga, right? So what do? You take it very close, take those statues very close to the Ganga. And where do you throw them? Where the Nala is coming, right? So at a very impure, you can see it happening, Chhat now. So don't you think it would be a good idea to read these things parallel, right? Not do just Islam and technology, but also do Hinduism and technology at the same time. What are, it would be much more productive, I think, because then we come out of our own enclaves. It's very wonderful. It's, bringing it face to face, this changing technology and keeping it open. Because yes, you're saying that context is actually deciding the attitude of the people. And technology is actually, creating conditions, right? For example, standing straight and Savdhan ki mudra mein while the national anthem, plays, is it possible? Because there are so many Deshbhakts in this country now, and somebody or the other is playing it as a ringtone and stuff like that. So when you do a kind of an excess of it, it becomes impossible to practice. So there's a different kind of, destruction of the aura that takes place if there's too much of everything, right? So no, thanks a lot. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much. I think all of them are very interesting ways to think about what I just discussed. So yes, I completely agree with you regarding the fact that the affordances sometimes, which is there in the title, ironically, so I call it affordances and anxieties. But I probably assume that affordances are a little more obvious. So the convenience of a Quran, which is religion in my pocket, it's right there. I just need to, whip it out and start reciting or reading or accessing it in whatever way. So you're right. But in the literature that I have, I'm familiar with, there is a very clear-cut acceptance and acknowledgement of the fact that it has been a huge advantage. It has actually helped people reach out, people, get access, something like even an online fatwa, for instance. That's something which has, again, democratized. So there are websites, and again,
like last time she presented.
Right.
Okay.
So there are different Darul Iftars or different seminaries would have online sites where you can submit a fatwa, submit a question and get a fatwa in return. So it's convenient, and of course technology definitely it aids religion. I won't even call it aiding religion. I think it just it's always been a part of how religion is accessed. We're just thinking about technology as digital technology, but technology has always been required to access religion in the first place. So yes, absolutely, religion exists because of technology, if you look at it that way. So yes, that's there, and I'll focus a little more on the affordance aspect, given that I assume that it's for granted. The second aspect of it, the body actually profane in a number of ways, but the listening body, there are no such restrictions on the listening body per se, because that's very often outside the purview of intentionality. Intention being a very significant, niya and niyat being very significant for any act. So whether or not you intend to hear it, so an azan is something which can fall in your ears, right? So it's not considered that big a problem in that sense. In fact, there is a debate which there's a debate with regard to the gramophone. And so there's this literature from Indonesia, which says that, what happens if, so when somebody listens to a Quran being recited, you also accrue merit, so does the reciter. So the question that the person was asking was, when somebody hears Quran being recited from a gramophone, does he or she earn some reward? One Mufti said, no. It's not real person reciting, no reward. The other Mufti said, of course, it's the recitation is happening and there's intentionality. So this entire thing hinges on intentionality. And of course, this excess, again, is something which is mentioned in this literature. So excess does definitely take away something from these constant, whatever's constant onslaught of sounds also. And this is something I'm forgetting who's writing about it. I think it's Navida Khan or maybe Larkin, but one of them is talking about it in the context of these excesses, which then make it sound mundane and routine. And that's the real loss. You know, the fact that these practices of inattention become our habitual modes of responding because we're constantly hearing, you know, loudspeakers and sorry, I think it's Larkin. So excess is definitely something which, with regard to Hinduism, what's interesting is, see, Barelvis, a lot of these Barelvi practices are actually castigated for being close to Hinduism. That's what is argued, that, you know, they're doing everything that the Hindus did, you know, so they're actually not doing the Islamic thing. So that's why I stay clear of, you know, going down that path. And I'm more interested in what the people say they're doing. Even the ulama, what they argue, what is the theological standpoint regarding how they defend it, but also what the people say. And for almost all of them, which is why I started to use the frame of ethics, which of course, this paper was not the space for it, but my primary frame of my actual work on Barelvis is on ethics, because I figured religion becomes too problematic, piety becomes very restrictive. So ethics, people are just trying to do what they think is correct and right. Sometimes it is very problematic when seen from theological perspectives, but then they are only trying to do what's right, and they're also accepted as Barelvis in the long run. So let's see what that ethical is. So thank you very much for the questions.
Yes, I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot from what you said. Very, very rich, full of insights. So, so I have two very specific questions, but first some praises that I want to sing in the spirit of the occasion. The thing that I like particularly about how you framed the whole thing was, and partly it's a kind of response to the question that Ravikant asked first. You are not looking at technology with a capital T as a subject of history or the agent of history, which I do believe takes us nowhere. It's like, you know, all that scholarship which says capital is what drives history, right? So, you know, so then the questions become like this: is technology good? Is it bad? What is the loss? What is the gain, etc.? You are not talking about technology with a capital T. You are talking about a kind of disassembled field of multiple forms, multiple devices, which is what makes your even description of the field so much more insightful. The other thing that I really liked about your presentation was that at a surface level, many of the questions that Barelvi believers and leaders are struggling with are actually generic questions to do with the digital age. And it's nothing specific to do with religion. So in the field of music, the loss of texture to voice via digital remastering has led to lo-fi production, all sorts of stuff. And, you know, and the idea that everything is always already mediated, that mediation as an experience has never really been available since the Tower of Babel, one could say. So, but what you are doing, that you are asking the very particular question, which is a question on religion as well, and not just the digital. By asking the question, what happens when religion goes digital, you're asking the question, what is religion too? Right? You're not only asking an influence question or a change question. So these are the two things that I really thought were very, very good paths to take in a collective discussion of this kind. Two specific questions I had in my mind. One was that I actually want to go back to the oral literature, literary point, and actually ask a question about language itself, which is to ask, in the specific case of Islam, one could actually, yeah, in Hinduism too, there is a sacred language, right? Arabic and Sanskrit are sacred languages. And in the specific case of Arabic, the question of translation itself was highly debated in South Asia barely 100 years, 120 years ago, right? So whether the sacred language is transparent, that is a medium that becomes invisible, or is the sacred language something that, you know, in some senses obstructs transparency and requires mediation and hermeneutics and interpretation by the learned, and or if can you, I mean, now, of course, translations are available, but what happens when there is Google Translate at your finger all the time? What happens? Can you recite the Quran in a language which is not Arabic? So mediation of and as language is a question that I wanted to bring in as well in the story. The other was about this, the sensorium question. I think what Dhananjay was trying to get at, he just put it in a complicated way, is the difference between the space. I mean, there are various things that you do, some in the space of congregation, some in a kind of space of withdrawal, right? And the sensorial ambient, the ambience are very different. What happens when you are individuated in a particular way via the handheld device, as opposed to being individuated in the corner of your room and doing your namaz alone, as opposed to doing it in the mosque on Friday? What happens to, I was not clear about the tactility, the touch question. I think that's a bit of a stretch. My feeling is that there's a return of the sonic with the digital, as opposed to its perhaps loss in the print form. And the sonic and the visual are at par in the digital moment, but I'm not 100% sure about the touch question, which is very much part of both Barelwi and Hindu practices all the time. The tactility of the whole experience. Of course, the smell has gone out of the window, right? So, and which is so much part of our urban habitation, and smell being something that also is part of shrines, with the, what do you call that, agarbattis and all sorts of, the clean and fragrance and clean smell is very much part of the experience of the sacred. So I'm wondering whether the sensorium question can be pushed further and thought through further. Okay.
Thank you so much for really for all the complimentary things. That, I mean, they helped. They actually helped me think through a lot of my own work. You really put it well. And of course, the questions are all very interesting. So this question of language is very, very, very significant, precisely because of the opacity of Arabic and classical Arabic. There is a lot of emphasis on tafsir and interpretations. And because of these existence of different schools of thought, there is a very strong debate around what tafsirs are appropriate for whom. So Barelwi ulama would very strongly argue that, you know, you should not read a tafsir by a Deobandi alim or by such and such person, precisely because that's supposed to lead you astray. That's what you will start to believe, that is Islam. So you're right about that element, but you're also right about this fact, the fact that, you know, you have translation tools at your fingertips today. But what's interesting about the Quran is that again here, the way the Quran is sort of thought about or engaged with makes it relatively more inaccessible, if you will. It is not as easy because, again, ulama will tell us, and ulama have told me that, every word in Arabic, and there are variations within the meanings, and it's very difficult to catch hold of the exact meaning that's being said, that he was discouraging me from accessing other tafsirs. But the argument goes thus, that you can't just type it and get a translation. It's not as simple as that. There's a context to it, there's a historical background to it, which would sort of take away from the meaning that might have been intended or that you should be taking. So, but yes, you're right about the language aspect, and that's precisely why a lot of these practices, a lot of these arguments do not actually happen among ordinary believers, simply because the assumption is that, one doesn't know Arabic. So it's the ulama who can answer these questions for us. So that takes away from that democratic idea that adab introduces in everyday life. This becomes a territory which then has to be ceded to someone who's in authority. And second, yes, again, this individuation, the sense of, because it's a fact that, the idea of the community and the collective is so strong, built into the idea of the ummat. And the mobile phone or handheld digital devices, the tablets, everything, they're all meant to actually accessed individually, and they can be the eases that they're accessed individually. And here, I think the anxieties that I was talking about, that research paper by Khan and Al-Ginahi, which I mentioned, where they're talking about how if we keep looking at the screens, so that sense of always of others, of especially children, not being able to see how one should be reading the Quran. So the child doesn't know whether you're reading a Quran or you're watching a video, simply because you're just looking at the screen. Whereas when you take out a book and you have that entire, economy of gestures oriented towards it, it becomes evident that you're going to do something which is set apart. This is definitely not part of your everyday. So there is this threat, and there is this acknowledgement of this anxiety that, although there is at the same time a celebration of this ummat which has expanded. So it's not just, my neighborhood, my mohalla alone. Now it's, we're all, and this shows in the discussion boards online. So the debates specifically between Deobandis and Barelwis and Ahle Hadith, which of course become very, very toxic very often. But it shows up, there's somebody sort of reaching out to you simply because you happen to have the same viewpoint on, let's say, the Prophet or adab, etc., which are the markers of who you are. So you're right, but there is this anxiety at the same time. And how much of it, in how much detail, is something which, again, I'll be very happy to look further into. It's a very good foray into something which should be explored more. And the sensorium. So you're right about the tactile aspect. I am still, that's why I did not include it here. It's something which I'm still working on. I'm not saying it's bringing it back in. You're right. It's sort of, more than bringing the tactile, it's brought in the sonic. And sonic, of course, has come back in a big way. Like I said, smells have gone out. But I still think something's happened with the tactile element. I won't say it's entirely gone out. There is this sense of still wanting to capture a certain texture. And I'm this, again, something I have not really delved into enough, but something I'm still only thinking of. But you're right, the smells definitely are something which are pretty much clearly lost. In fact, all these online rituals that you have. So I think O'Leary is only talking about how a candle is being burnt in a ritual. So it's an online candle. So it has no smoke. In fact, after the ritual, somebody hands out online sweets. And so somebody says, I can't have these sweets. I am dieting. And then another person responds, there are online sweets, so you won't put on weight. So this conversation itself, how there is this playful way of also acknowledging the losses which come with, moving to a virtual realm. So smells, yes, I'll definitely think more about this. Thank you very much for the questions.
मैम, बहुत ही इंफॉर्मेटिव डिस्कशन रहा ये, और ख़ासकर टेक्नोलॉजी के बारे में या डिजिटल डिवाइन के बारे में जिस तरह आपने बातचीत की है। जो अलग अलग सेक्ट हैं, चाहे वो देवबंद हो, बरेलवी हो, अहले हदीस हो, सब ने लाउड स्पीकर या टेक्स्ट के रूप में, रिटन टेक्स्ट के रूप में खूब प्रिंटिंग प्रेस के माध्यम से अपने आइडियोलॉजी को खूब प्रचार प्रसार किया है। मेरा भी इसी से जुड़ा हुआ एक सवाल है कि क्या ये भी देखा जाता है कि जो इल्म है, जो एक इल्म है, जो नॉलेज है, ज्ञान है, जो जैसे कि देवबंद की एक अपना क्लेम है कि वो कहते हैं कि हम टेक्नोलॉजी को एक स्किल के तौर पर देखते हैं, एक कौशल के तौर पर डिफाइन करते हैं, लेकिन इल्म का जो सोर्स रहेगा वो कुरान और हदीस से आएगा। तो मैम, मुझे इसके बारे में थोड़ा सा आप अगर इस पर बातचीत रख सकें। और सेकेंड सवाल मैम ये है कि कैसे डिजिटल रिप्रोड्यूस डिवाइन हो रहा है, जो आपका मेन मेन एस्पेक्ट था, उसके बारे में थोड़ा सा।
सॉरी, सेकंड क्वेश्चन आई डिड नॉट गेट, थोड़ा सेकंड क्वेश्चन बता दीजिए।
डिजिटल रिप्रोड्यूस डिवाइन के बारे में जो मैं बात रख रहा था मैम, उसके
अच्छा,
कि ये मेरा ये था कि सवाल इस तरह से कि जैसे कि जो 19th सेंचुरी रही है उसमें डिवाइन ऑथोरिटी को लेकर और प्रोफेट पैगंबर को लेकर जो बाकायदा और एवरीडे लोकल प्रैक्टिस, ये तीन ऐसे इम्पोर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट थे जहाँ पर देवबंद और बरेलवी का कॉन्टेक्स्ट देखा जाता है, और अहले हदीस का भी। तो ये जो जिस तरह के डिवाइन को लेकर या जिस तरह से डिजिटल चीज़ें आ रही हैं जैसे मोबाइल में देखने को लेकर, इसको कैसे डिफेंस किया जा रहा है, चाहे वो देवबंद के द्वारा हो या बरेलवी के द्वारा हो, या इसको कैसे क्रिटिक किया जा रहा हो उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में।
श्योर।
I think my question is very much similar to the first question that he asked about skill, but I'm thinking within a particular context of um, adolescents and kids, or who are just recent borns. I'm thinking that how would they make sense of religion when they are already exposed to this array of digital objects and devices? Will they make distinctions about the real and the virtual? Like, I'm just thinking, how would they make sense of binaries, like the transcendent and the material world, and then again the digital and the physical? Like all these, will they at all perceive them as binaries, or everything is a inseparable unit, or just?
Thank you so much. Thank you for both the questions. Yeah, sure. I'll take all three.
I just have a tiny question. I mean, you mentioned how the okay, thank you. You mentioned this instance of how the movement of sound through various devices, I mean, between the microphone, the amplifier, and then the loudspeaker, it's being explained in terms of physics, right? And so maybe there is a sort of push to sort of set the terms of the conversation in a particular way to make a case for what is real sound and what is not real, right? So is there any, my question is that, is there any effort to set the terms of the conversation, move it back to theology, or set the terms of the conversation in any other way?
Thank you so much for all the questions. So, what you're talking about in the context of Deoband here, this is again very similar to, I think, what Dr. Banerjee would say, again, technology becomes the capital T, right? Technology as a skill, technology something which we need to use as a tool in order to access religion which is out there. But जो मैं कहना चाह रही हूँ यहाँ पर, the source, जो आप कह रहे हैं इल्म का सोर्स कुरान है, उसको एक्सेस करने के लिए हम टेक्नोलॉजी इन दिस केस यूज करें, और जितना बेहतर हम सीखेंगे उतना बेहतर हम उसको एक्सेस कर सकेंगे। और मैं ये कह रही हूँ कि कुरान हमेशा से हमारे तक पहुंचा ही टेक्नोलॉजी के थ्रू है। कुरान हमने डिवाइन रेवलेशन तो नहीं सुना, वो हमारे पास पहले याददाश्त के थ्रू, मेमोराइजेशन के थ्रू, निमोनिक्स से, एब्सोल्युटली निमोनिक्स से, मेमोरी एज अ डिवाइस, उसके बाद बेसिक मोड्स ऑफ इंस्क्रिप्शन, आप लेदर पर और पेपर भी नहीं, आपके लीव्स पर हर जगह लिखा गया, वो भी आपकी टेक्नोलॉजी ही है, टेक्नोलॉजी ऑफ राइटिंग। उसके बाद प्रिंट हुआ, फिर टेक्नोलॉजी। सो कुरान हमें एक्सेस ही, हमने हमेशा body itself, as a device which is recruited in its entirety, right from the memory to the sensorium. तो वो पूरा हमारा रिक्रूट होता है. तो रिलीजन ऐसा नहीं है कि कुरान इल्म का सोर्स है और हमें टेक्नोलॉजी से एक्सेस कराने को वो करती है. कुरान आता ही हमारे पास टेक्नोलॉजी के थ्रू है. जो मेरा आर्ग्यूमेंट है, टेक्नोलॉजी विद अ स्मॉल टी. और दूसरा डिजिटल रिप्रोडक्शन ऑफ द डिवाइन, जो मैं भूल चुकी हूँ एग्जैक्ट क्वेश्चन क्या था. इसी को ठीक है, अगर आपको याद, अगर आप कुछ और पूछना चाहें तो आप पूछ लीजिएगा. मैंने लिखा बस यही था और अब मैं भूल चुकी हूँ. सर आपके क्वेश्चन था, या सो दिस इज अ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग conjecture, and of course I'll also be making a conjecture because to begin with, like as with I think most places, young children are very often very less interested in religion. So from whatever field work I have done, I did not actually find them interested in any of these. In fact, even when they would be accessing media, none of it would be a religious content. It's only it's only at a certain age, and also owing to certain circumstance, I've seen that certain again a very strong socio-political climate which moves them to find out certain things, and then of course they can be pulled in different directions. Again, something which I have not explored, I'm just talking about the literature. So but among young children, I think, from what I would think, considering there is this sense of media not actually being something which is which is equally part of the everyday. So this transcendent and the material might for them be a lot more interwoven than they are for us. They might be in a more commonsensical way. We are still struggling with these questions because we have, again, I think the way we are used to our sensorium being recruited for the purposes of religion or religious access is what makes this gap a bit of a concern for us. It throws us into some kind of a crisis, ontological and epistemological. Whereas for children, I believe, maybe, especially for those who are really born in a world which is digital in its entirety, I think this crisis might not. But again, this is a conjecture. I don't know how things are going to pan out, but I'll definitely pay more attention to this aspect when I'm looking at it. And yeah, so the terms of the conversation with regard to movement of sound, not just movement of sound, but what I found very interesting is, so there are these two parallel or even divergent, parallel and divergent ways of making sense of the world, as well as justifying or reaffirming arguments, one of which takes a very strong scientific, because science has a primacy which cannot be denied. So a lot of people would argue, Ahmad Raza Khan ne ye kaha, science bhi yahi keh rahi hai. Ab dekhiye, Quran mein ye likha hai, science bhi yahi keh rahi hai. So it becomes a way of reaffirming ye sahi hai. Although science is being used to justify the accuracy of something which you believe in any case was true. On the other hand, sometimes it's also theology which is emphasized over the scientific, let's say the geocentric and the heliocentric model. So Ahmad Raza Khan argued for a geocentric model, which is that the earth is the center of the universe. And a lot of ulama will tell you, we still don't know enough about the universe. When we do, we'll find out that the earth is the center. This is just a model, and models, again, a very, Thomas Kuhn kind of a paradigm shift, the fact that we think of it as this only because we don't know more. So there are both these very strong modes of reasoning which are employed, again, very contextually. So sometimes, but science, of course, owing to the primacy, and of course, in a world which, and in an education system where I think this post-enlightenment ideas of modernity and rationality are something which are not really critiqued as much as they should be, at least in a curricula. So then that becomes a very convenient mode of justifying even religion, which is interesting, which is very interesting, as always. Right, absolutely, absolutely. But thank you so much for the questions.
Okay, thank you for this very nice presentation. Threw up so many interesting ideas. And I think the very productive thing that's emerged from this, one is this language of, when digital media emerged, it was seen as a form that animated the body. And the Barelwi mode is also a form of animating the senses. So you use this conversation between these two debates. This is my sense of it. And that's one. The second thing that was very nice, I thought, was moving away from this language of the fall, which is how people see technology. It's a sense of loss. It's this kind of very classical sense of loss, but rather moving to this a more productive, generative, ecological sense where technology is not by ecological. I mean it's a habitus. It's not an external that impinges on language,
Right.
but it is the partitions are not clear anymore.
Absolutely.
And so thank you for this, and I do hope you return to CSDS.
I would love
Thank you.
to be back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.